Não levou à frente a promessa.
Virginia, I've seen your book on display. I've seen your book on display.
About study. Bom, eu estou de uma cita. Tem. Aqui. Olha, para os que não receberam o livro, né, porque a gente tem uma cópia de PDF, eu vou tentar enviar para vocês, mas acho que eu vou aceitar a oferta que a Regina fez. Eu vou mandar os PDFs todos para o e-mail dela e ela então vai redistribuir, tá? Obrigado. A gente vai colocar esse livro e o outro da coletânea de ensaios.
Let's try to finish this instrumentalist approach to the foundation of human rights. We have seen Griffin, we have seen the pluralist, so Nigel. We have seen the kind of ambivalent position of John Tasiulas, who is half an orthodox, half an instrumentalist. A foundation that is similar to that of Tasiulas is that by Henry Shue, famous book by Henry Shue is Basic Rights. Shue and David Miller more recently argue that there is a set of basic needs all humans have, independently of their different conceptions of the good life. Needs for food, water, air, but also for a minimum degree of social interaction and recognition are the first that comes to mind. While perhaps this approach avoids, what's the problem with it? While it avoids perhaps the under-inclusion of the agency-based approach, remember the fact that we end up including in human rights nothing more than those protections against the medicine that makes us stupid. While it overcomes this under-inclusion and perhaps also the over-inclusion that we have seen with Tasiulas, it still faces at least two remaining problems. On the one hand, the determination of this golden mean, something I've already announced, seems to be quite arbitrary. Okay, we want more than the protection of the medicines that want stupids, we want less than anything as long as it's not too burdensome for duty bearers, but to understand what has to be the golden mean, the right line, becomes quite arbitrary. Because who decides how basic a need is to be included among those generating human rights? On the other hand, quintessential human rights such as first generation civil and political rights can be traced back to basic human needs only by some stretching, so only with some difficulty. it is possible that our access to food and our psychological health will be at risk in a society where civil and political rights are denied. So you can make a plausible argument that if you live in a society in which you don't have the right to associate with other people, you don't have the right to vote, you don't have the right to participate in the political life, then your psychological health is in danger. I mean, at least you don't develop as much as you could in a free society. That's a plausible argument. But, and there is Amartya Sen's famous thesis that freedom of the press averts famine. It's not only good because it respects people. I mean, you have the right to express your opinion on the press, but it's also important to avoid social disasters such as famines. Famous argument by Amartya Sen: no democracy has undergone a famine, and that's not an accident, that's not coincidental, because only in a democracy you have freedom of the press. Freedom of the press creates a public debate about social problems and allow a population to take measures before the situation gets too bad and you enter into a period of famine. But on the other hand, proponents of this approach tend to take it for granted that one can easily reconstruct similar causal connection between all civic and political rights and those basic needs. This, however, should be proved instead of taken for granted. I mean, when I lectured in China a few years ago, it was astonishing the level of disinterest of Chinese people for democracy. In the sense that they made the argument, we don't care about democracy, we don't care about elections, we don't want democracy. It's not really the main thing we care about. We want to avoid famine, we want to avoid starvation, we want to have a decent level of material wealth, we want to have a healthcare system, we want to have these basic services at our disposal. We don't care about who is going to give us these goods or whether we are in charge for deciding, making the decisions in our society. Not only this comes from the common people, but also distinguished philosophers like my friend Daniel Bell, who has been teaching in in Beijing for 20 years now, recently came out with a book called The China Model, in which basically the idea is that the epistocracy, as he calls it, is better than democracy. So epistocracy would be the political system that is in China now, that you may think is just a despotic state, which is, by the way, but in the sense that the leaders, the political leaders, are there selected and not elected, which means that they undergo a process of selection depending on the results that they reach at lower level of the administration. So they start being the mayor of a city. If they do well, they move to become the governor of the region. If they still do well and they are free of corruption, and so they do well both in terms of political decisions that they make to improve the lives of the citizens and stay away from corruption, they keep moving forward up to, obviously, the political bureau of the Communist Party, which is the highest political appointment that you can receive. And Daniel Bell, who is basically one of us, in a sense, that is someone who studied at Cambridge and fully Westerner and so on and so forth, said, look, there is something that we might learn from this political system instead of keep on saying that they are barbarians, that they are just a despotic state and so on and so forth, because we being the Chinese avoid a lot of the problems that you have with liberal democracy. For example, the election of people who are completely ignorant to political offices, which is something that especially right now happens very, very often. Italy and Brazil here, happily together in electing. I mean, you know that the vice president, the vice prime minister now in Italy is someone who doesn't even have a degree. So he's the Minister of Economic Development. I mean, something quite difficult to handle, and he doesn't even have a degree. So we are all here more qualified than this guy, who is, in one of the most important posts in the Italian government. Yes? You had a question?
No.
No, about this. Okay, so why am I saying this? I'm saying this because this approach that tries to avoid the under-inclusion of Griffin and the over-inclusion of Casulas, and talks about access to food, access to clean air, this basic stuff, tends to leave outside of the sphere of human rights things such as civil and political rights, which since the very beginning were included in the list of human rights. So the problem with this approach is that it leaves out things that we think, for good reasons, that should be in the list of human rights, and that this approach is at odds, has a hard case in including. Finally, and this concludes our overview of the instrumentalist approach, we have the capability approach developed by Sen and Nussbaum. Now here we have a direct link between human rights and capabilities, that is, as I told you, real opportunities for individuals to realize their life plan. Nussbaum, and here why she's not that far away from Nigel, lists 10 or Finnis or other pluralists. Nussbaum lists 10 basic human capabilities: life, bodily health and integrity, senses, imagination and thought, emotions, practical reason, affiliation, relations to other species. This is as extreme as religion with Finnis. I'm sure you agree that relation with other species is one central goods in our life, but some people may disagree. Play and control over one's environment. I'm joking with Georgia, who has a nice dog, Chocolate. One of the most important figures in her relationships. And so she thinks that all human beings are entitled to these things as a matter of human rights. The problem with this approach, first, it shares with the most instrumentalist position, is quite simply the conflation between, on the one hand, needs, goods, capabilities, and on the other hand, rights. Again, it is one thing to say, I really need somebody to love, as the song. Yes, of course, our life without love is miserable, but it is a different thing to say that you have a human right, a right in general, and specifically a human right to be loved. So Nussbaum has this problem that she shares with all others instrumentalist approach, because it's the most important problem of the instrumentalist approach in general, this conflation between goods and rights. But more specifically, I think she also has the problem of having a list of capabilities, in this case, or goods, that is quite arbitrary. And I joked about the relationship with other species. We may have plausible arguments to say that relations with other species may be important. I love dogs and cats, but I don't know whether my human rights would be violated if someone, for example, for the sake of health security in the society, decides that I can no longer have a relationship with my cat. It's bad, but it seems to be at a degree of importance incompatible, incommensurably lower than the fact of being free from torture or free from starvation and stuff like that. Now, the problem of the conflation between goods and rights, as I said, teaches us the general lesson about the instrumentalist justification. Instrumentalist justification do not justify any right, in a sense, let alone human rights. They simply reinforce the importance for human lives of certain things with variation as to what these things are. So most of the instrumentalist positions are different because they identify different goods that we need, but they basically all share this conflation between goods and rights. They hardly provide an argument to move from the importance of the goods to the claim that we are entitled to them. To be sure, not all positions share this problem in the same manner. Tassiulas, for example, is well aware of the good right gap, and he tries to bridge that gap by reinforcing the idea of human dignity, by saying you cannot have a foundation of human rights without the idea of dignity. Still, his solution is to rely on a pre-given and, as far as I can see, merely stipulated equal dignity of human beings, stipulated because it's not argued for, it's just taken for granted, which leaves us with a disturbing impression of question begging. So you start by saying, now I'm going to give you a foundation of human rights. The foundation of human rights is that human beings have dignity. But don't ask me why they have dignity, and this is the foundation of human rights. At this point is better what the drafters of the human rights documents do. In all major documents about human rights, there is a reference to human dignity. If you look at the preamble of the Universal Declaration, there is a reference to human dignity. I mean, now I don't remember it by heart, but if you go online, it's very easy to grab. In the treaties of the 60s, is even stronger. They say that human rights are derived from the inherent dignity of human beings. So really a logical inference from the idea of human dignity to the specific human rights that the treaties list. But consciously, they don't, there are juridical texts, you can't expect a philosophical treatise on human dignity there. But at the same time, they make no reference to the ground of why we have dignity. So, and I told you why, for political reasons. If you look at the preparatory documents of the Universal Declaration, you really find this explicit decision made by the drafters not to talk about metaphysical groundings of this human dignity. We all agree that we have dignity. Good, that's enough. Okay, let's say nothing more about that, because this is going to create problems for us.
Luigi, can I?
Sure, yeah.
I would like to know if you consider this grounding of human rights, that would be dignity, is a political question or a philosophical question? What I want to say, if it's a question for the political people or a question only for the philosopher, you think that's important? This question of grounding the human rights is important to the philosophy or to make it effective in the world?
Right. It's a very good question. I ask myself the same question all the time. Well, it is certainly important for philosophers, right? That's what we do. Even if we end up like Joseph Ras with the conclusion that human rights have no foundation, as we will see. That's still a philosophical answer, right? We need to be convinced of the fact that human rights have no foundation. How important is the answer that we come up with for the practice of human rights, I guess? I mean, to the level of protection of human rights in the world. I have conflicting intuitions about this. On the one hand, I see the point that I just made, that the deeper you go with philosophy, the higher is the risk that you create problems for human rights instead of solving them. On the other hand, I think that in spite of the official unanimity on the importance of human rights around the world, there are a lot of people out there who think that in the end these are really dreams of well-meaning minds after the Second World War. I mean, all it matters is power. Humans are, have no intrinsic right just in virtue of the fact that they are human. All that matters is, power relationship, and nothing more is to be said. Now, for those people, a good philosophical argument to show that despite of the many horrible things that we are capable of, there are reasons to look at ourselves from a perspective in which we come up with at least interesting beings, special beings in a sense, could be of use. So I think that the philosophical answer to the foundational question may be of some use for those who are not convinced that humans have certain intrinsic rights. So it's against the skeptics, basically. Skeptics that probably remain silent and do not say explicitly we don't believe in human rights, but that in their hearts, so to speak, are skeptics. So I don't know, basically the honest answer to your question is that I don't know for sure. I said I have conflicting intuitions because I have much respect for the classical approach, that is, keep philosophy outside of human rights, because you are going to create more problem than anything else. On the other hand, one thing I'm sure, if you enter this game, so if you want to give me, if you think that it makes sense to give me an answer about the foundation of human rights, you can do what the Orthodox do today. That is merely saying we have human dignity. There is such a thing as human dignity without explaining in any way why that is the case. So that's pretty much how I see it. Yes?
You talked about the Declaration of Human Rights. Are you going to talk about that more specifically? I mean, the time of the history where this happened, the Second World War, and the Nuremberg trials, and this whole thing that began this thing. Are you going to, or?
No. No, I mean, partly because I don't know enough to tell you things that you cannot find online, basically. Secondly, because I'm rather keen on the distinction between the genesis of one thing and the justification of the same thing. That is, you can have a very interesting story of how human rights were born, in which, of course, the things you were mentioning are important. I mean, there is this book by Susan Moyne who claims that it is pretty much a mistake to think of human rights as something that was born in 1945, 1948 to be precise. So there are two historical schools about human rights. One argues that human rights were born pretty much with the French and American revolutions. So the first declaration of the natural rights, the ancestors of human rights are natural rights. The second school says no. Any connection between natural rights and human rights is a very confusing suggestion to understand the specificity of human rights. They claim no, human rights were a novelty in the philosophy, in the history of ideas, because unlike natural rights, they do, well, first, as I told you, they try to stay away from any metaphysical grounding, which is not the case with natural rights, obviously, because even in the secular Enlightenment, like with Kant, you had a metaphysical argument for human dignity. It's not, you know, just a mentioning of human dignity and take it for granted. Whereas human rights, you know, are quintessentially political instruments that do not need a moral foundation and should not have a moral foundation. And that's their specificity. That's why their date of birth is 1948. So what happened before has really not so much to do with what happened there. Now, these questions, interesting as they may be, I don't think, are going to give us an answer to the philosophical question about the normativity of human rights. So, independently of when were they born, Enlightenment or Second World War, the question of whether they have some normative foundation or not is to be answered not through history, right? So it's a quintessentially philosophical question. The way in which they were born, the genetic point, is not going to give you an answer to the normative point, to the point that I am focusing on here. That's why I'm not covering these things, besides my ignorance. Okay, why don't we move to the Orthodox, of which you know already pretty much everything. But let's focus a little bit more on who are the most representative exponents of this group. So while instrumentalist starts with the identification of some more or less subjective human goods and then moves quite magically to their transformation into things we have rights to, non-instrumentalism, or orthodoxy, it's the same thing, relies on the intrinsic worth human beings supposedly have. The point of human rights is not that of protecting the interests of humans, but of protecting a status humans possess, and in virtue of which the interests of humans have some importance. So, the important thing is to understand the status that gives us the right to have rights, so to speak, the right to be taken seriously. So it is by virtue of this status that the interests humans have acquired normative force. Now, Kant puts it in these terms: fundamental human rights are not concerned with protecting a person's interest, but with expressing his or her nature as a being of a certain sort, one whose interests are worth protecting. They express the worth of the person rather than the worth of what is in the interest of that person. Thomas Nagel, who was not talking about human rights directly, but about fundamental rights in general, endorses Kant's intuition about person's worth as the basic ground of fundamental rights. Like Kant, he doesn't think it necessary to justify that status, and that's where I disagree. Nagel stops any further inquiring by arguing that any attempt to render more intelligible a fundamental moral idea will inevitably consist in looking at the same thing in a different way, rather than in deriving it from another idea which seems at the outset completely independent. So, if you want to give a foundation of human dignity, Nagel thinks, sooner or later you are going to move in a circle. You are going to apply to another fundamental idea in Kant, autonomy, reason, but itself might need a justification or something like that, and therefore, according to Nagel, you will be moving in a circle. So at one point, the justification game has to stop. You have to appeal to something that is so intuitively clear, like the card, so clear and evident that it doesn't make sense to raise questions about that. Buchanan, more recently, thinks that human rights cannot be grounded by appealing only to the goods they secure and protect, so he's not an instrumentalist. He argues in favor of this conclusion by using an illuminating example. So here's one of the ways in which also you can think of the limits of the instrumentalist approach. That's why I'm mentioning Buchanan here. Let us imagine a female chief executive, so very higher up in the hierarchy of a firm. She's very well paid. She's well paid for the top position she occupies, and therefore has a good life. And let us further imagine, however, that for the same job she's paid slightly less than a male top executive, merely because she's a woman. So the male top executive makes €1 million a year, she makes 900,000 euros per year for the same job. So she's paid a little bit less, but still a lot, right? Now, our intuition strongly suggests that we have here a clear violation of human rights. Even if none of the goods the woman needs for a decent, or in this case even very good life, are put at risk by the lower compensation. So it's not the case that you can say someone who makes 900,000 euros per year doesn't have the instruments to have a good life, right? Anything that the society can provide has been provided, other than finding the right lover, which is up to you. But anything the society could do was done. But at the same time, this discrimination with the male top executives strikes us as a violation of human rights. It's the quintessential example of a human right violation, because you are discriminating me just because of my gender. It doesn't matter that the interests I may have are not touched by the consequences of this discrimination. It looks like that my status has been violated, right? So I think that Buchanan example is quite illuminating to see what's the problem with the instrumentalist view, and why the Orthodox school has some grasping on this issue. In fact, it illustrates how human rights have to do with the protection of a status, in fact, of an equal status. That's the point of Buchanan, his famous article, The Egalitarianism of Human Rights. You don't understand human rights unless you understand that there is a strong commitment to equality built into them. And a commitment to equality is very difficult to reduce to the interest protected, because even if you are slightly unequal, you can still have extremely good lives. You can have all the interests protected. So there is this deontological element in human rights that Buchanan highlights, which I think has to be preserved in any convincing account of human rights. What happened here? Ah, nice. I think that I'm not online. Might be.
The internet cable.
Right. Okay. Now we have to find it again. Sorry. I think I remember what I wrote, but
Page 49.
what?
Page 49.
But I don't know how to insert the page. I think it's covered by this bar up here. Let's see. So this deontological element. Now, the editors of the collection I gave think that the adoption of non-instrumentalism, so you can avoid adopting, that you can adopt non-instrumentalism, but this does not imply the rejection of the idea that human rights are grounded on a plurality of goods. Human rights could be grounded both on, like with Tasula's, on human status, dignity, as well as on their ability to promote, further protect certain objective human goods, such as agency, freedom, capabilities, and so on. So they also think with Tasula, Mikkel, Wenar, and others, that there are good reasons to think that relying on moral status only will never deliver the list of human rights we are accustomed to, with absolutely no idea of what matters to humans, and left with the bare notion of the fact that they possess a status, this other thing that we will never be able to cover the numerous areas of human interest protected by human rights, from civil and political liberties to access to food, shelter, bodily integrity, and so on and so on. Now, are they correct with this reminder that you cannot do without a reference to human interests or needs in the foundation of human rights? Well, this is a very delicate point, and it's important to be careful. I think that much could be said against this syncretistic approach, I like to call it, so this combination of orthodoxy and instrumentalism. But the main problem is that, it seems to me, this position conflates two levels in a foundation of human rights that should be kept clearly distinguished. On one level, there is the question of what provides normative force to the idea that humans have a status that entitles them to certain basic rights. That's the first level. Call this level the foundational level stricto sensu, so strictly speaking. On a less profound level, there is the question of what goods need to be secured for having a life compatible with that status. And this second level is mainly, to me at least, a technical question that depends on the level of our social and psychological knowledge, on historical circumstances. For example, I mean, it would be bizarre to argue for a human right to freedom of the press in the 12th century after Christ, when the press was not invented yet. Of course, the specification of human rights heavily depends on the technological development and so on and so forth. So this second level, if it's not a fully technical issue, it's mainly a technical issue on how to translate the status that you have already secured at the first level into specific human rights that you want to introduce. So the second question, despite appearance, is not part of the foundation after all. That's at least my impression. Whereas this syncretistic approach, Tasula's, Krufliau and Renzo, these people think that they play a similar foundational role, both the idea of human dignity and a reference to human interest. So I'm not a syncretist in this case. I'm a hardcore orthodox. Two other non-instrumentalist positions are worth mentioning. The first one we already touched upon, with that by Alan Gerwirth. Gerwirth, remember, is the ancestor of Griffin, the one who had this transcendental argument about human rights. Here, one starts from the idea that we are all purposive agents. We all act for some good that we consider as worth pursuing, independently of which good that is. Now, since freedom and well-being are necessary conditions for the pursuit of any end, it follows that we are constrained to want freedom and well-being, which is equivalent to say that we want the freedom and well-being of all to be protected through human rights. Now, the second position has been recently proposed by Catherine Flickschuh, that's the second position I want to discuss. I mean, we already saw what's wrong with Gerwir's approach, and has a similar transcendental flavor. Flickschuh thinks that human rights are constraints we cannot help embracing if we accept the task of designing rules for others whom we have no permission to coerce. Both positions have serious weaknesses. Well, okay, we already noticed the weaknesses about Gerwir, so I'm not going to say anything about that. As for Flickschuh, it seems to me she begs the whole fundamental question by assuming that legislator ought to deliver laws under the constraints she imagines. The whole point of the foundation of human rights is to explain why legislators have those constraints. That is, why any law that does not respect the equal status of human beings violates something that has normative force. So Flickschuh, as a matter of historical point, is led to this strategy by her dubious interpretation of Kant's theory of the innate right to external freedom in the metaphysics of morals. And since she refuses to accept both the role that Kant himself assigns to this right, that is, the foundation of the entire metaphysics of morals, that's my reading of the metaphysics of morals, be careful, and the justification Kant gives of that very right, that is, that we have it by virtue of our humanity, the result is that in a foundation of human rights presented as Kantian, because Flickschuh intends to give a Kantian foundation of human rights, the resources that Kant himself provides for the enterprise are ignored. The foundational approach that this project intends to submit does just the opposite, as we will explain later. So, what is the general story about orthodoxy? Orthodox non-instrumentalists, which are the same, think that you cannot explain human rights, ground human rights, if you refer only to human interest. They usually bring into the idea of human dignity, and they think that without it, you are never going to be able to explain the normativity of human rights. The problem I see with the current orthodoxy is that nothing is said, nothing substantial at least is said in explanation of why we have this dignity, which gives me the idea that there is a lot of question begging in orthodoxy as it is practiced today. Okay, let's finish with perhaps the most popular approach to human rights today. If you look at numbers, at least, people who fall in this last category. Practice-based or political foundations. An increasing number of leading scholars, including John Rawls, Joseph Russ, Charles Bates, Alan Vigana, I'm no longer sure that Alan Vigana should be placed in this category, I have to say. Samantha Besson and perhaps Thomas Pogge also to a certain extent, think that the essence of human rights is to be found in the role that they have come to play in the practice of international politics. In particular, human rights define the limits of states' sovereignty and, as a consequence, identify the cases in which the international community, under whatever institutional form it presents itself, has the right to intervene to protect individuals from national authorities. Now, so the political view is, you want a foundation of human rights, look at what human rights do in international practice, what they do today. Mainly, they limit the sovereignty of states. That's something that nobody, not even the orthodox or the instrumentalists, deny, obviously, because that's what human rights are. But the political view is, look a little bit better at this function, because you will find in it pretty much everything you need for a foundation of human rights. Why? Well, let's see. First of all, political philosopher, exponents of the political view are not committed to say that there is no deeper moral layer below human rights. But they say we don't need a reference to that deeper level. So they are non-committal about the existence of, the moral foundation of human rights. They simply say we don't need that. We can explain the normativity of human rights without making reference to this moral level. Nothing essential is left out, in their opinion, if we just justify human rights by looking at the role that they have come to play in international practice. So the nature of human rights is that of defining limits of sovereignty, of national sovereignty, and their foundation, assuming that this is a distinct question, is the de facto acceptance of these limits by institutions around the world. In the succinct definition by Rawls, human rights restrict the justifying reasons for war and its conduct, and they specify limits to a regime's internal autonomy. Rawls from the Law of Grievance. So, the question about the normativity of human rights is to be answered according to the political view by looking at what human rights already do in reality. Do you have doubts about whether human rights have normative force? But stop doubting, because they already perform a function in international practice. They do limit national sovereignty. They do allow the international community to overstep and criticize things that governments do to their own citizens. Therefore, their normativity is not a problem because they already have this force. Now, of course, there are variations within the practice-based or political approach. Tassiulas distinguished, who is not a political, Tassiulas talking about political philosopher, distinguishes between a subset view and a sui generis view. The subset view holds that the political, sovereignty-limiting dimensions of human rights is just a necessary complement to whatever normative force human rights already have from other sources, by virtue of human dignity, for example, or by virtue of their ability to promote and protect the needs we have. The sovereignty-limiting dimension would be a component of human rights normativity that the orthodox view overlooked. Now, the other view, the stronger sui generis view, defended by Bites, for example, Charles Bites, The Idea of Human Rights, 2009, holds that the normative essence of human rights is exhausted. There is nothing more than that. Is exhausted by the political function, and any reference to an underlying layer of universal moral rights is at best superfluous, if not misleading. Okay, subspecies types of the political view do not pose much of a challenge to the traditional or orthodox view. In fact, they simply add one dimension to the essence of human rights, the state sovereignty limiting dimension, that the orthodox view allegedly overlooks. No orthodox is so stupid not to know that one of the functions of human rights is to limit national sovereignty. Maybe the difference is that an orthodox would not make that function part of the justification of the normativity of human rights. Not that they deny that they perform this function, but okay. Because orthodox do not deny that the normativity of human rights depends also on something other than this political function. The subspecies types do not deny that the normativity of human rights depends also on something other than this political function. Now, if that is the case, subspecies view are parasitic on other foundations of human rights, orthodox or of other kind. Why? Because they rely on the foundational job that has already been done in explaining the part of the normativity of human rights that does not depend on the sovereignty limiting function. So in order to assess the political view, we must focus on the sui generis type, so on the stronger kind of approach. So, to be fair to the political exponents, let's try to imagine the most defensible form of this sui generis type? I think it's something like the following. We don't know, and we don't need to know, whether human rights rest on some underlying set of universal moral rights or on some fundamental respect-conferring features that humans possess. We don't need to commit ourselves to the assertion of a link between human rights and an alleged intrinsic dignity of human beings, because the normativity of human rights is already demonstrated if one looks at the function that they have come to play in contemporary international politics. So, as I said, the idea here is to understand the question, the foundational question in terms of, are you sure that human rights are effective, that they perform some function for the life of human beings? Once you frame the question in this way, of course the answer is yes. Human rights already perform a function, because nobody denies that they limit national sovereignty. I mean, if you don't respect human rights, you do not enter in the European Union, just to mention one point, which is a rather big political effect. I mean, Turkey has been trying to enter the European Union for 20 years, and she doesn't enter because she doesn't respect human rights, according to the mainstream view at least. So, of course, human rights make a difference in the world. So, the political exponents say, well, if they perform this function, it means that they are normatively strong, that they have a normativity. Otherwise, how can you explain this? And what else has to be said in order to explain this normativity? Well, what's wrong with this political approach, in my view, and then I'll stop and we can discuss a little bit. To begin with, one rather sophisticated reply could be, oh, wait a minute. By saying that the normativity of human rights is exhausted by the state sovereignty limiting function human rights have, you make the existence of human rights dependent on the state system. So human rights are exist as long as there are states, different states out there. Because if they have to limit the sovereignty of states, and there are no longer states, then human rights are no longer necessary. So either if we live in an anarchical world, in which there is no political authority, or if we live in the world government, it looks like the human rights are no longer there because there is no need of limiting anything. Now, that's a sophisticated criticism, but it's not the main criticism. I mean, you may argue, the political exponent here can come back, look, it's very easy to transform my position in order to apply also to the world government. Human rights could be out there in such a way that the power of the world government is limited by this external authority. So it's not true that my position is dependent on the existence of the state system, which, by the way, are going to be there for quite long, apparently, despite all this talk about globalization and so on and so forth. The most serious problem for the political view is different, though. I think that it could be expressed in the form that it violates what Joshua Cohen is a student of John Rawls. He belongs to the Rawlsian right. Because I like to distinguish students of Rawls with Hegel in a left and a right. The leftists are Pauge, Weitz, and so the right within the liberal, so we're talking about leftist philosopher anyway, in a sense, social democrats, or whatever you want to call them. but more moderate and less moderate, more extreme and more moderate, if you want. So Cohen is the more moderate strand. He says, look, you need to respect the fidelity condition if you talk about human rights. What is the fidelity condition? The fidelity condition is that any argument, any philosophical argument that you propose about human rights cannot come up with a description of human rights that is too distant from the way in which human rights are already practiced. So imagine that you come up with a theory of human rights of a perfectionist flavor. Human rights are reserved only to the best of the human beings, those who excel in the arts, in the sciences. Maybe you have a very strong argument to support this position, that you have to reserve the right to be treated as equal only among the best, only this aristocratic approach to human rights. Cohen, the fidelity condition says, I don't really care how good your philosophical argument is to support the case that human rights should be conceived along these perfectionist lines. Because your description of human rights, no matter how well philosophically grounded, is too distant from the way in which human rights are usually perceived and the function that they play in international practice. So my point here is that I think that the main problem with the political view, paradoxically, because you might think that political view is the one that is closer, is in the best condition to respect the fidelity condition, but my point is that paradoxically the political view is the one that most violates the fidelity condition. Why do I think that? Well, as I said, this condition demands that any philosophical account of human rights must be faithful to, number one, the way in which human rights are introduced in official documents, and two, the way in which activists use them around the world. The political view is particularly bound to this constraint because it construes the normativity of human rights by looking at the practice of human rights. So if this view ends up with an account of human rights that is far away from the practice, it's particularly embarrassing, right? Now, it is highly dubious that the very idea of reducing, because that's what the political view does, the idea of reducing the normativity of human rights, the function they play in international politics, is compatible with their practice. The main human rights document, from the Human Declaration on, all introduce human rights as the expression of the intrinsic dignity of human being, keeping the central intuition of natural law and natural rights, in my opinion, the ancestors of human rights. Those documents construe the normativity of rights as fully independent of states, institutions, and established patterns of international politics. Precisely because of this independence, they are thought capable of limiting the authority of states and of critically assessing politics as traditionally practiced. So, the quintessential idea of human rights is that they criticize existing institutions. They do not go along with what the international practice is. So the political view seems to be unable to capture this critical element of human rights. Human rights are external standards. They do not mirror what the practice does. They criticize the practice. Now, if then the practice becomes compatible with human rights, good, fine. But one should have clear in mind that they remain external elements. In fact, if the international practice changes and we go back to a sort of Westphalian world in which everybody is entitled to do whatever it prefers within national borders, if we follow the political view, it ends up that we no longer have human rights, because the practice now has changed. So it seems to me that this inability to preserve the critical element so crucial for human rights makes the political view unable to respect the fidelity condition. It violates the fidelity condition. So an alternative way of seeing the same problem is this. Human rights have certainly come to have the function on which practice-based accounts insist. What remains obscure is why human rights are to be conceived as nothing but that specific political function. If the answer is that this is what practice has made of them, then we need to be very clear about what we mean by practice. Certainly this reduction is neither the way in which human rights are presented in official documents, remind you the reference to human dignity, nor the way in which they are usually understood by activists around the world who see in them the expression of an intrinsic dignity of the human being for which action is required. If you ask a member of Amnesty International, I mean, why do you try to protect the human rights of this guy who has been put in prison in Iran simply because he was protesting against the government, or presumably the answer is going to be, well, the dignity of that guy or that woman has been violated. They don't say, well, we usually do these things, you know. It's by now a common pattern that we do not accept this kind of oppression on the part of the government. So, again, paradoxically, it seems to me that the political view is the position that is farthest away from the practice of human rights. It's not the closest, it's the farthest away. So, I mean, at this point, defenders of the political view could make a last move to defend themselves. What is this last move? Well, they could draw a distinction between the culture of human rights and the contemporary practice of conceding that the former may be at odds with the political view, but the latter, the practice, is actually in line with it. So drafters of human rights documents, activists and orthodox philosophers may have thought that human beings have a fundamental moral dimension on which their political role rests, but the practice of human rights suggests otherwise. Today people, ordinary citizens or officials, identify certain rights as human rights simply by checking whether they perform the sovereignty limitation rule that we discussed. In other words, the practice of human rights has introduced the following existence condition. A right is a human right when it is widely accepted that its violation justifies interference in domestic affairs. Nothing more is required. This is what Ras calls the ordinary phase of human rights. And it is in virtue of consideration of this sort that I can conclude that the use of the term human rights in legal and political practice and advocacy either relies on the legal recognition of human rights as limiting state sovereignty, or claims that should be so recognized. So Ras think that when you use human rights out of the role that they already play in the international practice, you are implicitly relying on that role for the argument that you're making. The problem with this line of thought, and that's the last point I want to make, that comes close to a last resort argument left to the political view, is twofold. On the one hand, in acknowledging its distance from the culture of human rights, remember the last move is, let's draw a distinction between the culture and the practice of human rights. You may be right that we are not so faithful to the culture of human rights because usually, people think of human rights as being derived by human dignity. Okay, fine, I concede that to you, but let's focus on the practice of human rights. Because if we focus on that, you will see that my position, the political position, is the one that accounts best for human rights. So, in acknowledging the distance from the culture of human rights, this move concedes that it violates the fidelity condition. On the other hand, in focusing exclusively on the practice, narrowly defined to include only the current patterns of international politics, so international human rights, the ordinary phase of human rights, it renders human rights too dependent on the status quo and on the contingent circumstances that led to whatever de facto consensus is now available. Should the international system fall back to a Westphalian stage, would we say that ethnic cleansing perpetrated by government against its citizen is no longer a violation of human rights because the international community now thinks of it as a strictly domestic issue? It could be argued that proponents of the political view do not need to rely on the consensus currently or contingently available, but on the principled distinction between matters that may or should be of international concern, such as torture, and matters that may or should be of international concern, should not be of international concern, such as marital fidelity and soup that never becomes a matter of international concern when you have the army at your door. But anyway, so how could we draw that distinction if A, practice ex hypothesis cannot be a guidance? So what is this actually? That was the second last move. This is the last move. The last move is this. Okay, fine. You're right, we don't have to make human rights too dependent on contingency. So today we think that if the government commits ethnic cleansing, it's okay to intervene, to say at least something that this is wrong. Tomorrow we might no longer think that it's okay, and therefore we have a theory of human rights that says that, if tomorrow the international consensus that ethnic cleansing is not that bad, ethnic cleansing is no longer a violation of human rights. Okay, I get that. Let me rephrase what I mean, talking from the perspective of the political view. What I really mean is that we need a distinction between things that should be, not are, should be of international concern, and things that should not be of international concern. So, on the one hand, we have genocide, ethnic cleansing, torture, what have you, avoidance of starvation, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, we have lies, we tell each other in private relationships, infidelity, and this stuff that evidently nobody thinks should become a matter of international concern. The first things are those protected by human rights, the second things have nothing to do with human rights. So, that's the last move. Now, my problem with this last move is that if you move from how things are, so de facto now we think that ethnic cleansing is a violation of human rights, to how things should be, ethnic cleansing should be an international concern. Of course, you have to explain to me where you find the resources to understand that ethnic cleansing should be a matter of international concern. Because at this point you start begging the question. If you tell me the distinction I like is the one that on the one hand puts things that should be protected by the international community, that should overstep national sovereignty, and things that should not, then I'm going to ask you, well, on what grounds do you draw this distinction? Where is the normative force? What is the normative basis for drawing this distinction? Because at this point, you are no longer relying on the practice, you are relying on something else. But then, of course, either you fall back to the orthodox position, or so you should restart talking about human dignity, or you go back to non-contingent human interest. It's not, it's very unlikely that we will not be concerned with access to water and food in 2000 years. So that there is a certain stability in our needs. So either you go back to instrumentalism or you go back to orthodoxy. Otherwise, I don't understand how you can draw this distinction between things that should be of international concern, things actually. Well, there is another position, but I'm going to skip on that because we will go back to the political, to the global reason alternative. So I would like to stop here because it's already 12:13, and ask you what you think about this excursus, whether there are questions, you want to add something, criticize my reconstruction of this stuff, whatever, and then perhaps I'll say something more towards that. It's not necessary to say anything. I don't mind that. Are these three positions clear in their distinction?
I just want to clarify something here. That last part that you talked about, the gap between something that are in a way, and people are trying to derive that and should be.
Yes.
Is this the same fallacy that they say it's is ought fallacy, trying to derive from descriptive premises, some prescriptive
conclusions?
I think it falls in this problem, and I think the only way to solve this problem is to go back into the orthodox. Because I don't know if I'm being so accurate with your position, but it seems to me that if a person has some kind of skeptic position about moral foundations, like you said, someone that doesn't believe that there is any foundation or moral. This last position of a non-practice based cannot answer that person in an efficient way because they don't have a foundation. They say, I don't need a foundation for that, I just need the practice, and the practice works. So the only way to answer some skeptic about this problem should be the orthodox.
Or the instrumentalist. Even if you are, instrumentalism is as good as orthodoxy in answering the skeptic. Because the instrumentalist tells the skeptic, are you really telling me that you are not interested in food, water, avoidance of torture? The best you can do is to say that you are interested, but the other people's, it doesn't matter. So you need to be, you have to become an extreme egoist if you want to keep skepticism about human rights and at the same time avoid instrumentalism. Because I'm just trying to say that if you want to counter skepticism, instrumentalism and orthodoxy promises to do this with equal force. Now, I don't believe that instrumentalism is good as an answer, but it is an answer to skepticism. Whereas, as you were rightly suggesting, the political view, by avoiding any reference to human needs or to human dignity, instrumentalism and orthodoxy, and relying completely on the practice, the only thing that can tell the skeptic is that he is out of fashion, basically.
Yes.
You don't believe in human rights, but everybody does. So, thinking